Coming up, a look at the Islamization of the West according to Dutch parliamentarian Geert Wilders. Great to have you with us again. Our program today is part 2 of our discussion on Geert Wilders' drive to stop the Islamization of the West. To sum up, Geert is the controversial but popular Dutch parliamentarian who created the film Fitna, which depicted texts from the Quran and violent acts committed by Muslims. On the Front Line did an interview with Geert on his first visit to Canada. Part 1 can be seen on our website. Before we show you part 2, here are some highlights.
Let me first say that I make a distinction between the people and the ideology. I have nothing against Muslims. I have nothing against people. The majority of the Muslims in our free societies, whether it's Canada, the Netherlands, or other parts of the free world, are law-abiding people who want a good family life, a good education for their children. There's nothing wrong with that. I wanted to show that the Quran is not only a medieval book that is somewhere on the shelves with a lot of dust on it, but it's very alive today. The Islam has one goal, and that is to submit, whether by persuasion or by force and violence. So I want a full stop of the immigration from Islamic countries in order to stop the Islamization of our societies. Don't be fooled by political leaders like Angela Merkel, the Bundeskanzler of Germany, or David Cameron, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, of President Sarkozy of France, who said recently, all of them, that the multicultural society is dead. They forget to say that the elephant in the room is Islam. Why is the multicultural society dead? Because we Islamized our societies. Why is the multicultural society different in Canada? Because people came to Canada, like 1 million Dutchmen, among which some of my own family, contributed to Canada on an equal basis without wanting to dominate the Canadian society. And they did their fair share and strengthened it, your beautiful country, Canada. The immigration in Europe is totally different, has totally different reasons and totally different cultural background. The average people see when they send their children to school, when they go to visit their grandparents in the elderly homes, when they go to work, when they travel in the trains, they see the problem. They don't feel at home anymore in their own country. They are not xenophobes. We are a very tolerant country in the Netherlands. If I would represent an intolerant party, I would have 0.7% of the vote. We have between 15 and 20% of the Dutch vote. And those people are not extreme. They just want to fight for their own identity, and they want to fight crime, and they want to stop the mass immigration from Islamic countries. And this is changing all over Europe. You see that there is a panic between the political elite because parties like mine are getting stronger, and they know that the people are not longer being fooled by stories about multiculturalism and immigration anymore. And what is happening in Europe will also happen to Canada and to the United States. So people have to wake up, see what it is, don't get angry or violent to Muslims, but see what Islam really stands for and make a choice. Do you fight for your own culture, which once again is based on Christianity or Judaism or humanism, with all the values that we share, that are tolerant, that are non-violent, or do we choose to have more of an ideology that goes for violence, for domination, and for all the things that we do not wish to have in our societies?
As soon as we get back from the break, we'll show you the full continuation with Geert. Don't go away. Welcome back to On the Front Line. I'm Christine Williams. Take a look at part 2 of our interview with Geert Wilders. You talk about street terror being exerted by Muslims in Dutch cities. Can you explain what that is?
Well, everybody is talking about, and I understand it because it's a serious global problem, about Islamic terrorism. But the average people in my country have more problems with what I call the street terrorism. And in many cities in Holland, whether it's in Amsterdam, in Rotterdam, in Gouda, or in any other cities, there is a lot of crime committed by young Moroccans, often, not only Moroccans, but they are a very big part of that. And what they are doing, they are making life hell for their neighborhood. They are committing crimes. they're beating up drivers from buses, they are tearing apart young girls from their bicycles, they are beating up homosexuals in the street of Amsterdam. They are doing the worst thing ever, and we should not accept that anymore. We should have stiff penalties. Also here again, if you abide by our laws, there is no problem, but if you overstep the mark, there is a problem, and we have a major problem. If you look at the statistics, I'm not inventing this, if you look at the crime statistics in Holland, you see that many of those groups are overrepresented in 5, 10, even sometimes 20 times more crime committed than the indigenous people.
I'd like to hear your analysis of the Islamization that you see unfolding in the West, in countries like Britain and in France and beyond.
Well, you know, I see so many things happening. What I see happening is that the Islamization process is continuing, and that the political elite is not really waking up. Don't be fooled by political leaders like Angela Merkel, the Bundeskanzler of Germany, or David Cameron, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, of President Sarkozy of France, who said recently, all of them, that the multicultural society is dead. They forget to say that the elephant in the room is Islam. Why is the multicultural society dead? Because we Islamized our societies. Why is the multicultural society different in Canada? Because people came to Canada, like 1 million Dutchmen, among which some of my own family, contributed to Canada on an equal basis without wanting to dominate the Canadian society. And they did their fair share and strengthened it, your beautiful country, Canada. The immigration in Europe is totally different, has totally different reasons and totally different cultural background. So it's getting worse, and the politicians are afraid that parties like mine, we became very strong in Holland, the third party in the Netherlands, and in other countries, parties like mine could get stronger. So politicians get very nervous that things will change, because the people have woken up. The people, and this is the good news in Europe today, the people have woken up. The political elite are trying to ignore the problem or playing a bad copycat, but the people are fed up with it. The average people see when they send their children to school, when they go to visit their grandparents in the elderly homes, when they go to work, when they travel in the trains, they see the problem. They don't feel at home anymore in their own country. They are not xenophobes. We are a very tolerant country in the Netherlands. If I would represent an intolerant party, I would have 0.7% of the vote. We have between 15 and 20% of the Dutch vote. And those people are not extreme. They just want to fight for their own identity, and they want to fight crime, and they want to stop the mass immigration from Islamic countries. And this is changing all over Europe. You see that there is a panic between the political elite because parties like mine are getting stronger, and they know that the people are not longer being fooled by stories about multiculturalism and immigration anymore.
Barack Obama has been the subject of criticism by many in his approach in dealing with the war on terror. What is your feedback regarding Barack Obama?
I'm not here to to criticize either Canada or the United States. I'm a Dutch politician, and I talk about Islam. You know, Canada, as the United States, are democracies. And whatever I believe or think about Obama or about your Prime Minister and your elections, you are a democratic country, and you should decide for yourselves. I comment on either. I'm a European politician, so about Europe or about countries that are not a democracy and where I feel I have a responsibility. I'm not here to criticize your government or the US government, but what I will say to all of them is that please wake up, because the elephant in the room is not only in Europe. What is happening in Europe today with the Islamization will happen here in Canada, is happening here in Canada and in the United States as well. And if you don't wake up, and if you want to preserve your freedom, if you want your children and your grandchildren to live in a free Canada and in a free United States, you will have to act. Don't forget, last week in the Netherlands we celebrated, as we do every year, we celebrated the Liberation Day after the Second World War. It's a national holiday. And there were so many Canadian soldiers at that time, especially Canadians, who helped who gave their life, Canadian heroes, for the freedom of the Netherlands. And I would say that it would be so sad that instead of respecting them, and we respect them a lot for that, that after 60, 70, 80 years later, we again lost our freedoms for another totalitarian ideology called Islam. So also for them, we should fight to preserve our freedom. And what is happening in Europe will also happen to Canada and to the United States. So people have to wake up, see what it is, don't get angry or violent to Muslims, but see what Islam really stands for and make a choice. Do you fight for your own culture, which once again is based on Christianity or Judaism or humanism, with all the values that we share, that are tolerant, that are non-violent, or do we choose to have more of an ideology that goes for violence, for domination, and for all the things that we do not wish to have in our societies?
Ever since the release of the film Fitna, is your life in danger? And tell us what that's been like for you.
Well, I live this year for 7 years now under threats, under protection. My wife and I lived in prison cells, in army barracks, in safe houses. I had to wear wigs, mustaches, change places every few days. And so yeah, unfortunately, my life is in danger. In the process of fighting for freedom, I lost my own freedom. It's something that you would not wish your worst enemy to have no privacy. If I go and see someone, I have to tell the special police, the royal police, if you're diplomatic police in Holland, 2 days in advance where I go, everybody who I'm seeing, and I'm only talking about in the Netherlands. Abroad it's even more difficult. But I'm not complaining about that, because it's not about me, it's about the fight for freedom. And I know one thing, if I would moderate my voice, or if I would leave politics, that the people who use non-democratic means, the people who want to kill you, the people who use threats, they would win. And I will never, ever let people who use non-democratic means win. I'm a democratic elected politician, I have a mission, I fight for freedom, and even though I lost in the process my own freedom, I will never give in to people. I will debate anybody, inside Parliament, outside Parliament, but I will never give in to people who use undemocratical means.
After the break, we'll continue our in-studio discussion with our panel on Geert Wilders' drive to stop the Islamization of the West. Don't go away.
Visit us on the web at onthefrontline.tv.
Welcome back to On the Front Line. Joining us in our studio to continue our discussion about Geert Wilders' drive to stop the Islamization of the West, Paul McKeever, leader of the Freedom Party of Ontario, and Ijaz Tahir, Secretary General of the Islamic Circle of North America. Thank you both for joining us for part two.
Well, thank you, Christine. Thank you.
Now, before we begin discussion, I'm going to start with a little preamble here so that we can set the tone of what we'll be discussing here. Now, this is from my perspective. I see that we do have an issue. We saw what happened with Ezra Levant being dragged before the Human Rights Commissions for his republishing of the Danish cartoons of Muhammad. We saw what happened with Maclean's magazine and Mark Stein when it came to trying to publicize what's going on in terms of the global drive to establish Sharia law, particularly through jihad, some of what came out in that film Fitna as well. We saw what happened in Austria with Elizabeth Sabatich-Wolf, who spoke out against what she saw as an Islamization and was also sentenced by a judge. We are seeing some trickling down coming from the United Nations that is supported by the Organization of Islamic Conference, challenging repeatedly the Western right to free speech. There have been numerous calls to jihad. We're seeing problems being perpetrated. We're seeing calls to violence being perpetrated. We know what's going on in the Middle East when it comes to Israel, the only democracy as we know it in the Middle East. Yet Hamas, in the charter, it calls, literally in the charter, for an obliteration of Israel. The Palestinian Authority Charter also calls for an obliteration of Israel. There's clearly a problem. And I know that we may differ in our discussion about how Geert Wilders might choose to go about his fight. We do differ, all of us differ, but to deny that there is a problem, I think is being a bit less than honest when we see what's going on globally.
Yeah, I agree with that ultimately. And I think our politicians here, both federally and provincially, are failing with respect to the Human Rights Commissions, for example, that took Ezra Levant and Maclean's to task over expressing themselves. We see, for example, at the provincial level, Tim Hudak of the Progressive Conservatives, he said that he would scrap the Human Rights Commissions. A couple of weeks ago, he said, no, he's not going to do that. Why? There's an election coming. Federally, we have Section 13 of the Human Rights Act. And a Conservative Prime Minister who is actually in favor of freedom of speech now seems to be unwilling to do anything about it. Free speech is the front line of the war against theocracy. It's the front line of the protection of democracy. And there's no more time left for politicians to be wishy-washy about it.
Now, I want you to reply to this, but there's something else I want to add. We're not out to get anybody, okay? Because everything that we're saying here is documented. This is not about being anti-Muslim. I mean, our audience has heard Dr. Zuri Jasser. He's a Muslim himself, but he advocates our democracy. We're seeing what's happening even in family court. I spoke to somebody that works in the family court system at a very high level. And what's going on is that we're seeing fathers that are used to Sharia law, that have come, that have immigrated here, and they're so angry because their daughter is shaming the family by not wearing her head covering, talking about wanting her dead, talking about she's a disgrace for the family, she shouldn't be living. These are major problems that we're facing here, and the question is, how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to control this?
Well, I think that we need to go back to the original spirit of Islam and look at that, the whole thing with that perspective, that we quote individual examples and then connect it with Islam. So that's where there are so many cultural things, socio-political factors, and then something happening in Pakistan when we import it over to Canada and label it with a problem, then it's hard to solve that problem. So the thing is that if somebody commits violence, Islam never permits that, Islam never endorses that, and that's very clear. So if we are talking about that does Islam permits to beat your daughter for not covering your head? No, absolutely not. So if somebody has
So obviously you don't advocate either spanking your wife and putting her in a room, but you see there are texts that say that. There are violent texts in the Quran that call for jihad, that, and I've seen where it says spank your wife and put her in her room. Now the Muslims that I know personally will not spank their wife and put her in her room. But you've got those immigrating here that have come from these countries, and they're bringing it here because they believe it should be done. We're seeing it in the courts, and people don't like to talk about it because it ends up being politically incorrect, and they end up being called anti-Muslim.
Well, you know, the Democratic front, I mean, we talked about freedom of speech, that's kind of the political front, but the Democratic front is the ballot box. And I think when Geert Wilders says, you know, we've got to limit or stop immigration from Islamic countries, what he's concerned about is numbers. Mark Stein, his book, America Alone, it's about the demography. And, you know, the number of people voting in favor of theocracy could grow to the point where democracy itself would have been voted out of existence. So I think clearly, with the majority of Muslims in Canada not following every dotted I and every crossed T out of the Quran, we've got to support them in that. But with the people who are coming over who are not used to that sort of Western lifestyle, we have to do more to make sure that our democracy is protected.
Now we need to be very careful not to demonize all Muslims, because even Geert Wilders had said, this is not something we do. If somebody considers themselves a moderate, he believes that the Quran calls for violence, that we need to support them all the way. But I have had guests on my show, moderates, that advocate our democracy, and they do face death threats. They do face it. It's not an isolated incident. They face constant threats, they face harassments, and this should not be going on in our democracy. There's clearly a problem. Ijaz?
Yeah, absolutely. I will repeat the same thing, that there's no room for violence for anybody and towards anybody. So that's out of question, that if you attach it to any religion, that would be injustice. And coming back to the freedom we are talking about, just to make a point, by the way, logically, that if everybody says here, it favors some issue or some law, you don't have a choice. This is democracy. And I disagree with Paul in the sense that, you know, if majority of the people living in a country favor something, and that democracy will be out of...
That's a critical point. It's an interesting one. And Ijaz, I must go for a break. When we come back, we're going to go straight back to you to finish what you're saying and allow you to reply. We'll be back after this. Don't go away. Welcome back to On the Front Line. Jazz, continue what you were saying.
Thank you. I just want to make a very quick point, as you said in bullets, that going back to the Mr. Wilders interview, that I don't hate Muslims, I hate Islam. So you see, the hate is the starting point for something which he's trying to achieve. That will not work. That's totally un-Canadian. And in Canadian perspective, we talk about nobody will agree on that. And the second thing is that he says, no, there's no moderate Islam. So, and at the same time, he says, majority of the people, Muslim people, they're law-abiding citizens, they're nice people and all that. So there are clearly contradictions.
He's contrasting the text, though, the text from the people. He's saying that the text is political and it calls for jihad, but there are those that are peace-loving, and we need to make that distinction.
Absolutely,
Paul,
yeah. It's absolutely correct that you should hate, for example, Mein Kampf, if it recommends the murder of Jews. It's absolutely appropriate you should hate any text that recommends doing any evil. It's not wrong to judge. In fact, that's the problem with multiculturalism that he's addressing. You have to be free, you have to have the freedom of speech to condemn evil, and if there are evil aspects in any text, whether it's religious or not, you should be free at all times in a democracy to say so, and you must say so for the protection of freedom.
But you see, even what Terry Jones said, I think it's abhorrent what he did. You don't burn a Quran to provoke people. However, it's still his democratic right. And the fact that people will be afraid for their life for doing this, when the Bible gets burnt in other countries, it gets spat on, it gets used as toilet paper, why are people having to face fear for their lives if they decide to do something that might offend Islam?
Because the government is not coming to their aid. It's not defending their life, their liberty, and their property. It's saying we must appease those who would use violence against us. I think our politicians are failing us. I think our governments are failing us. And we need people that will stand up and say, no, if someone does something that's going to arouse the passions of a handful of rowdy people, the police should be there to protect them. The government shouldn't be there to condemn him.
Jazz, we need to fight against that. Does a person have the right to come out and criticize Muhammad publicly if he or her so chose?
Well, we have hate speech laws.
Yes,
in
we
this
do.
country.
But if you wanted to say something against Muhammad, do you believe that you should have the right to come out and say it? The right to come out and say it?
Well, as I said, I would say it again, that Mr. Wilders is most welcome to come back here and say whatever.
I'm asking you.
Say
do you
whatever
feel that you should have that right?
He wants to say. And then the hate speech. I mean, I'm not deciding here. Authorities have decided. We have laws. And anybody who, and I agree with Mr. Wilders, anybody who crosses red line
I
should
respect
not
you
be
fully for coming on, but you didn't answer my question, whether you feel you should have the right to criticize Muhammad if you chose. I want to thank you both so much for joining me today. It was great having you on. And that's all the time we have. See you again next time. I'm Christine Williams, and from all of us, thank you for watching.
To see more interview material and to leave us your comments, visit us on the web at onthefrontline.tv.